Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you especially for your Canadianism as you followed in line so peacefully as we loaded this room. This is phenomenal. We are so excited about the event and about your being here. So welcome to the 2017 TD Walter Bean Lecture in Environment. My name is Jean Andre, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Environment here. For nearly 50 years, our faculty has been working across disciplinary boundaries to create sustainable solutions needed to address complex environmental challenges facing the world, and the need has never been greater than it is today. I'm also your MC for the evening, and in that context, I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. I also want to point out just a few members of our audience. First, let me say how pleased we are to have such a strong representation from the TD Canada Trust and TD Friends of the Environment Foundation. We'll say a bit more about that in a moment. They partner with us each year in making all of this possible. We're also pleased that the Mayor of Waterloo, Dave Jaworski, right here, and the Mayor of Kitchener, Barry Verbanovich, not right here, are with us. Of course, we have our university leaders as well. We've got Ferdinand Hamdallahpour here. We've got Ian Orchard and the deans extraordinaire lined up, and a number of others as well. We are so thrilled that this event sold out. It sold out 3 weeks before the event. It is incredible. We knew when we had identified that Dr. Jeffrey Sachs was the person who we wanted to come, we knew it would be well received, but we still are completely blown away. We know that in the audience we have many donors and community partners. We have students, alumni, faculty, staff from all 6 of our faculties. We have high school students, and in fact, this morning, we had 250 high school students from 5 different schools and 5 different communities come to be part of a panel discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals and what we can all do. And of course, I want to officially welcome Dr. Jeffrey Sachs and Dr. Sonia Ehrlich-Sachs to our campus. I want to say how honored we are that you did accept our invitation. He was in a Bernie Sanders campaign office, I think, or at a convention when I talked to him on the phone, and I was sure he would say he's too busy, but he said yes, he was prepared to come and spend some time with us. This is really special because it's the 150th anniversary of Canada's Confederation. It's the 60th birthday of the University of Waterloo, and it's the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the TD Walter Bean Professorship in Environment. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to invite Joanne Shoveler, who's our Vice President of Advancement, to the stage to bring remarks on behalf of the university and to acknowledge TD's tremendous support. Joanne.
Thank you very much. As Dean Andre mentioned, it's an incredible opportunity to bring so many people together this evening, and what an honor it is to be listening to the great lecture that we'll be having. As Dean Andre mentioned, 2017 marks the 25th anniversary of the TD Walter Bean Lecture in Environment, and it also marks the University of Waterloo's 60th anniversary. TD and the University of Waterloo have had a long-standing partnership based on mutual values for the environment, for service to our communities, our youth, and to teamwork. Through Walter Bean and TD's generous philanthropic gift and long-standing endowment, the TD Walter Bean Professorship allows the University of Waterloo to invite internationally renowned leading experts such as our esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, and bring our community together as it has done tonight. Since the creation of this lectureship, TD has also created a number of scholarships and bursaries which generously support our students, the leaders of tomorrow. Today, more than 190,000 University of Waterloo alumni in more than 152 countries are impacting our communities both locally and globally. So on behalf of the university, our community, and our students, I would like to sincerely thank TD for their past and continued support in the future. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Anna Yakveli, Senior Vice President, TD Canada Trust, Western Ontario Region, and Chair, TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, who will deliver remarks on behalf of TD. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wow, this place is sold out. Not bad, eh? Congratulations, well done. So thank you very much, Joanne. It's a pleasure to be here tonight on behalf of TD as sponsor of the 20th Walter Bean Lecture in the Environment. So as the Senior Vice President for TD Canada Trust here in Kitchener-Waterloo and across Western Ontario, I'm very proud of the investments that TD makes locally to support literacy and education in creating opportunities for youth and for the environment. Part of our mission to be the better bank is to help build vibrant, healthy communities. A healthy economy depends on a healthy environment. And as you may know, TD has a strong focus on the environment. Our TD Friends of the Environment Foundation has been working in partnership with charitable organizations, investing millions of dollars annually in grassroots environmental projects. So since 1990, TD Friends of the Environment has supported more than 24,000 projects with over $75 million in funding across communities in Canada, and specifically here, investing more than $2.6 million in 1,000 projects here in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is amazing. So in addition to funding the local project, TD Friends of the Environment engages volunteers and communities through TD Tree Days programs. And so through that, a number of volunteers from brownies to bankers roll up their sleeves to add thousands of trees annually, 50,000 to be exact, and to provide an urban canopy. So across Kitchener-Waterloo, TD employees and community partners have planted over 2,000 trees in a united effort to green where you live. So this year, we're very happy to celebrate our 150th. By celebrating Canada's 150th, TD is supporting a signature project here at Waterloo Park. It's known as the Jewel of the City. Waterloo Park was the first park to be established in the city of Waterloo back in 1890, and the site where the city celebrated Canada's centennial in 1967. So today, it's an urban oasis for the residents looking to connect with nature. As part of TD's Common Ground project, Waterloo Park's Central Street entryway will become more of a welcoming pedestrian-friendly entrance to the park, and the Central Promenade Bridge over Silver Lake will be twinned to provide a safe, separate unit for cyclists and for pedestrians. And so there will also be a lookout over Silver Lake that will provide an opportunity for small-scale events. And a gathering place will be created at the Central Street entrance, helping us achieve our goal of helping communities come together to enjoy their local parks and green spaces. So we're very excited about that project, as is Mayor Dave.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so lastly, we're also committed to investing in the future of our young people, especially in our area of education. The majority of our university funding is directed to student bursaries, awards, and scholarships. So in recognition of both the importance of education and the environment, TD Canada's Trust established the graduate scholarships in the environment with an endowment of $900,000 to the University of Waterloo in 2003. In 2012, we donated a further $750,000 for the TD graduate bursaries in the environment. So in the past 25 years, TD has made community investments in the University of Waterloo that exceed $3 million. So we're very happy. So we are very proud to count hundreds of University of Waterloo alumni among our employee base. So on their behalf and on behalf of my TD colleagues and many that are here this evening, we want to, and more than the 400 we actually employ in this market, let me extend a thank you to the University of Waterloo for your continued environmental and education leadership. So thank you very much.
Okay, and now the introduction. So, as some of you who have come out year after year are aware, and for all of you who have been looking at the PowerPoint slides as they show, you'll know that this particular lecture, this event, brings to campus some of the world's leading environmental thinkers and doers, those who provoke us to learn more or to do differently or both. This is certainly the case tonight. And I've already spent nearly 10 hours with Dr. Sachs, and I am on fire about what we could achieve together, I have to say. Widely considered one of the greatest minds in international economics and sustainable development, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs has written best-selling books, received numerous awards and honors, including the Blue Planet Award in 2015. He's played a pivotal role in developing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, about which I'm sure we'll hear more in a few moments. And he's advised dozens of heads of state and other leaders, including the Pope, on economic strategy and policy and sustainability. He's also had a profound impact on global education. To address the challenges that face sustainable development professionals and practitioners, perhaps some of you in the audience today, Dr. Sachs co-chaired a year-long commission working with 20 eminent scholars and practitioners from a variety of disciplines to develop recommendations to support the emerging field of sustainable development practice. The result was the first Masters in Development Practice program, or MDP as it's called, and the creation of a global association of some programs then in short order. And we're so pleased that the University of Waterloo was one of the first partners in launching its own MDP, a program that is housed in the School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development in my Faculty of Environment. Now, currently, Dr. Sachs is director of both the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network and the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University's Earth Institute. He refers to himself in one of his books as a clinical economist. Others refer to him as a visionary economist. So tonight, we will hear how diagnosis comes together with vision, as Dr. Sachs speaks to us about the future of our Earth. In this talk, entitled Rising Nationalism versus Global Cooperation for Sustainable Development, Professor Sachs asks us how, in this era of Brexit, or border walls and immigration bans, how can the world come together to achieve sustainable development goals? Goals such as protecting the environment and providing clean access to water. But I assure you, he will convince you that together we can do it. Welcome, Dr. Sachs.
Good evening, and thank you very, very much for the warm hospitality and for the honor of inviting us and inviting me to give this prestigious lecture. And happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday for Canada, for University of Waterloo, and for the TD Lecture Series. So it's absolutely phenomenal that we get a triple celebration. And we do have some to celebrate, and we have a lot of weirdness to contemplate, too. So I'm very happy to be in what I like to call the sane part of North America. It feels very good. We may stay here for a while, by the way, so depending on how things go, it's getting a little strange in my part of the woods. But actually, we're going to be okay is my message. Well, not that we're going to be okay. We have a lot of hard things to do. But Donald Trump is not going to be the one to wreck things. It's going to be us, if we don't act, that will be responsible for this. He's so weird that he actually can't get away with much of anything. It's just watching an unreality show day by day, and he's actually not our biggest problem. We are our biggest problem, which is that life's complicated. We have to do a lot of complicated things in a relatively short period of time. Normal politics is not organized for the kinds of challenges that we face. And one of my main messages is that universities have a unique responsibility and role to play in this period, because it's not really mainly about politics, though it's a lot about politics. It's mainly about complex decision-making, where we need a lot of expert understanding and a lot of capacity to frame the problems that we face in practical ways that can deliver solutions for us. The good news is that we are the inheritors of one of the greatest waves of scientific and technological know-how in human history. We're in a gold mine right now of everyday phenomenal discoveries, and we're speaking with the president of the university about quantum computing and what's happening at this university with its breakthroughs. Unimaginably great things. It's a matter of harnessing that knowledge to the practical problems that we face, and it's a completely doable proposition. I'll start with a couple of great leaders who really did lead and could lead. And with President Kennedy's statement in his inaugural address in 1961, which I think defines our real existential fate of our time. And he said famously in the inauguration, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." This is really the modern fate. We're so powerful at what we do technologically. We're the inheritors and beneficiaries of such incredible knowledge, scientific understanding, technical capacity, that we literally can end poverty, and it's not even a heavy lift. But we're so powerful at what we do that we can wreck everything as well. And of course, when President Kennedy spoke these remarkable words in 1961, he was referring to the possibility of thermonuclear war, which emerged just a year and a half after he spoke these words in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the world came closer than is imaginable to self-destruction. Now we can look at the same words and we understand that nuclear war remains a risk and a major risk, but we have added new ways to abolish all forms of human life through environmental destruction as well. We only had some glimmers of that in 1961, though there were glimmers. But over the decades since then, we have come to understand that our human activity through an ever-growing world economy is putting so much pressure on the physical environment that we can doom ourselves not only through war, but through the continued application of current technologies that we now understand to be reckless and unnecessary for our future. Let me add another great man, your late, great Prime Minister Lester Pearson, a Nobel laureate, an inventor of many, many of the institutions of decency of globalization. Of course, it was UN peacekeeping that got him the Nobel Peace Prize, but he did a vast number of things in creativity and vision for global cooperation. And that book, Partners in Development, was a remarkable book, not only because it was one of the first books I was assigned as a freshman at Harvard College in 1972. It was actually the third book on our reading list that year, so it was my introduction to development, but of course, much more importantly, it was an invitation to global decency, where the rich countries were called upon to help the poor countries out of their extreme poverty. And it was done with great clarity and with a simple overriding message, which I'll return to shortly, that if the rich world would give 1% of its income for the poor world, that solidarity would be enough to put an end to extreme poverty. And of course, he was completely right, and he and President Kennedy were people we remember as the kind of political leaders that understood politics to be the art of improving human well-being, something that we don't often think of as politics today in my neck of the woods. We think of it as power, as cynicism, as backroom deals, as recklessness, as fantasy, increasingly, as midnight tweets. But we can remember that politics has to be something much, much bigger than that. So I want to talk about sustainable development. What is sustainable development? Sustainable development, in my view, is the concept of our time for finding our way out of danger and leading to a better world. It's defined by the United Nations as a world that aims and achieves three things: economic prosperity or material well-being, social justice and inclusion, and environmental sustainability. So it's a triple bottom line idea that we cannot achieve human well-being by an economics alone approach. We have to achieve it by a holistic approach which understands humanity in its holism. We are individuals that have material needs and aspirations, that's fine, but we are also, as Aristotle said, social animals which need to live in a decent community, a community that is fair, that is just, that is inclusive. And we are physical beings that are part of the Earth's physical systems. And if we destroy the environment, if we change our climate so fundamentally that the climate that humanity has developed, that has lived under in all of our human development is destroyed, that will destroy our base of survival. And it already is destroying the base of survival of tens or hundreds of millions of people around the world. We sometimes don't notice that. Our attention span is perhaps our most limiting factor, but it's already happening. And the essence of achieving sustainable development is a battle. It's the age-old battle. It's the age-old battle of living decently, living virtuously, living with what now is called pro-sociality, so that we're looking after each other and we're taking care of our responsibilities, versus a life in greed. And when greed takes over, and that's what's happened in my country, in the United States, recklessly and relentlessly, greed has taken over, we're blinded. And that is really our biggest danger. How do you know greed has taken over? Because when you have a piece of legislation, as we did last week, on health care, the Destruction of Health Care Act, where the Congressional Budget Office scores it as taking 24 million people out of coverage, and the president and the Speaker of the House shrug their shoulders and say, "So?" you know that you've lost it. And that is our danger. We'll get it back. Americans are a lot more decent than Trump and Ryan. And that's why the legislation went down in the end. But our political structure is a structure that champions greed and almost nothing else. It's a money system morning till night. And that's our real battle right now. Our real battle is to be decent versus to allow greed, narrowness, extreme nationalism, us versus them, phony ideologies, which are actually promoted not even as real ideologies, but as promoted as further vehicles for greed to win. So, we've always had this battle, and our economic system has been an uneasy, some might even call it a Faustian bargain, of dynamism and greed from the very start. And we now have to tame this for our survival. So to see that, I want to step back to help us get a big picture of where we are right now, and then hone in on what it means practically for all of us, for us in North America, for us at universities, for us as citizens of the world. So if you'll give me 5 minutes, I'll take us on a 5-century tour, and we'll try to understand this challenge in a historical context. I'm going to start with another favorite quotation of mine and a favorite author of mine from the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith. And I'll start with this comment in The Wealth of Nations that I find one of the most perceptive comments of modern thinking. So Smith, remember, was writing in 1776, and he was looking back to the 270 years, basically, of globalization, which can be defined practically as when the different parts of the world united in awareness of each other with the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And Smith wrote in 1776 that the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies and by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. It's quite a statement. This guy was a very sharp observer. So he's saying that the voyages of Columbus and da Gama, the two greatest, most significant events in the history of mankind. Their consequences have already been very great. That is, in the 280 years since they occurred. But in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. What benefits or what misfortunes to mankind may hereafter result from those great events, no human wisdom can foresee. By uniting in some measure the most distant parts of the world, by enabling them to relieve one another's wants, to increase one another's enjoyments, and to encourage one another's industry, their general tendency would seem to be beneficial. So globalization, here is the philosopher of globalization, Adam Smith, and he's saying the tendency of uniting the world would seem to be beneficial. But to the natives, both of the East and West Indies, all the commercial benefits which can have resulted from those events have been sunk and lost in the dreadful misfortunes which they have occasioned. These misfortunes, however, seem to have arisen rather from accident than from anything in the nature of those events themselves. At the particular time when these discoveries were made, the superiority of force happened to be so great on the side of the Europeans that they were enabled to commit with impunity every sort of injustice in those remote countries. So what should have been a global, mutually beneficial event, Smith points out, turned out to be a disaster for part of the world. Then he goes on. Hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all of the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which, by inspiring mutual fear, can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. What is Smith saying? Smith is saying that someday the weaker parts of the world, the ones that were so badly damaged by their contact with more powerful European countries, will gain in power so that that mutual benefit of interaction can occur. And how will that occur, says Smith? Amazingly, he says, by the very act of global commerce and trade, which will spread ideas, share technology, and allow for a proper balancing of power in the world. I want you to hold that thought for a couple of reasons. First, the sheer decency of it. Because a normal writer writing in Scotland in 1776 would have said, look at how great we are. But in the Enlightenment, the message was a global, universal, and humanistic message, that we can't be satisfied until there is global benefit. That's the first. And the second is that he predicts, and I will come back to that shortly, that globalization itself eventually will be the force of rebalancing. That, I believe, is happening now. And that is one of the key characteristics of our own time. Now, in this first period, though, we learn a lot about emergent global capitalism. It was incredibly impressive because for the first time, even without your iPhone 6, there was global scale industry. Unbelievable. You could import primary commodities from thousands of miles away, bring them for processing, manufacturing, establish global trade on that basis. The energy, the dynamism, the creativity of it is the wonderful positive force of capitalism. But at the same time, it was a nonstop horror. It was built on slavery. It was built on war, conquest, depredation, incredible violence. And that marriage of dynamism, entrepreneurship, boldness, creativity, reimagining, transformation beyond belief, forging in 1500 a global system of trade shown by these routes for coffee and tin and sugar, tobacco and other commodities. Being able to do that through that energy is phenomenal. But the cruelty with which this is done is also stunning and is our constant reminder of what we're capable of doing. And it is that twinning of the dynamism and the destructive force that remains today our greatest challenge. Now, the second great phase of globalization came actually in Smith's time. And it came fundamentally because of one marvelous invention. 1776 was very important for a few reasons. You know that year. Most important because Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. Second, you may not have been aware that James Watt took out his patent of a commercially viable steam engine in 1776. And the third crucial event of that year, of course, was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then something else happened. Jefferson wrote something also very good that year. So it was a year of wonderful publishing and a great invention. And this invention, more than any other invention of modern history, fundamentally transformed the world. Definitely on par with the printing press, the compass, and perhaps the invention of agriculture in its fundamental role in transformation. I would say that it is the single basic explanation for this graph, which shows the best reconstruction that we have of income per person on the planet going back 2 millennia. So what this graph shows is that something changed around 1800. And what changed is what economic historians call the breakout from the organic economy. Because up until the steam engine of Watt, all the energy that we could muster was basically in the form of human physical labor, often by slaves, or animal traction, or wind in the sails and a bit of wind and water in the mills. But that limit of mobilizable energy was so strong that it meant that economies were essentially characterized by subsistence and a struggle for survival that had little changed for thousands of years. And then the breakout, and the breakout to a mineral-based energy system, to a fossil fuel energy system, made powerful by Watt's discovery of how to turn thermal energy into motive force, how to move cranks and gears and turn it into transport and factory motion, was fundamental in enabling modern economic growth. So for those of us who study development, it almost all starts now in 1800. It starts with the uptake of the modern economy, because up until then, 90 or 95% of humanity, even including the dukes and the princes and the aristocracy, lived basically in poverty, lived in rural areas, lived in subsistence farming. And then the world was fundamentally transformed. Now, the way it was transformed was incredibly uneven. And that is why we study economic development, to understand essentially this graph, which is a graph constructed by the same macroeconomic historian, the late Angus Madison, of the differential rates of industrialization. It all started in England, truly. And then it spread. And it spread to the United States and Canada, and it spread to Western Europe, and then from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and there was a long diffusion process. And economic development tries to understand, or should take as its core question, why the spread was so unequal, uneven, and took such a long time. But basically, by the mid-19th century, Western Europe was already transformed as an industrial society for the first time in history. Most of the rest of the world not. In Asia, the only industrialization that occurred was in Japan after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. And for most of the rest of the world, there was transformation because Europe became a pole for commodities, and it became a military powerhouse, of course. And one of the facts of this unequal development was European imperial conquest. And so the first phase of industrialization had produced the colonial or imperial empires of the Americas. Those gained an independence through all of the events of North and South America in the 19th century. But the rest of the world after 1800 increasingly fell under European imperial domination because of the profound inequality of power. Actually, Africa was the last to fall, mainly because of the microbial barrier, mainly because of malaria, in fact, because every time Europeans tried to invade, they would die until the critical modern invention of gin and tonic, which was, of course, the drink of imperial choice, because the tonic, of course, is quinine. Quinine is an extract of cinchona bark, a Peruvian traditional antipyretic, anti-fever, which was understood by English scientists as seeds were stolen, brought back to England, multiplied, and put into a good cocktail for the colonial administrators to sit on their verandas and conquer Africa. And that happened in the 1880s. So by 1914, the world was a European world. And essentially, the Middle East was created in this period. The modern Middle East turmoil was also created in this period, as I'll summarize in a moment. But this, again, for me, is another marriage of economic might and grave injustice, because the imperial world was a brutal world. It was a world of oppression, and it was a world that fundamentally blocked industrialization and development in the conquered lands, which was most of the world. And it blocked it in the core way, I think, because the imperial powers understood one thing: don't educate the locals. That would be politically dangerous. So the one consistent imperial policy was, other than educating a small number of locals, maybe the sons of the chiefs, to be local administrators of the imperial powers, no mass education. And without mass education, there was no chance for economic development under the imperial period. So Britain, more than any country, made this country, and it made the modern world. Since there's a wonderful geography department at Waterloo, I would say that the main lesson of this map is it's sometimes good to be landlocked, because basically any place with a shoreline was invaded by the British Navy at some point or another. A few places like Uzbekistan and Mongolia, Chad, Central African Republic, Mali. I don't know why. Well, they never got to Cote d'Ivoire because the French got there first. And then Bolivia and Paraguay, the two landlocked countries of South America, were the only ones spared a visitation by the British military. This is modern capitalism. Britain made the modern world economy more than any other country. It's, again, a feat of astounding energy, astounding contribution, astounding creativity, astounding entrepreneurship, and astounding brutality at the same time. All of it together. And the British legacy is, of course, our modern world, all the good and the bad of it. And when you look at any day's reports of the disasters in Syria or in Iraq or in other parts of the Middle East, thank Britain and France for what they made, because we're still living off the long shadow and the long legacy of the geopolitical disasters and the artificial countries created by imperialism and the sheer ruthlessness of it. We're in the 100th anniversary of a lot of that sordidness in the midst of World War I, and we can't quite shake the legacy of that period up until now. So the story continues. The modern world developed, it became a European imperial world, and then Europe nearly destroyed itself. And for no discernible reasons, by the way. But between 1914 and 1945, there was one nonstop continuous bloodbath. Well, it was not continuous in the bloodbath, but two wars of destruction, the likes of which we had never seen, because without the industrial capacity to kill as many people so rapidly, it could never have occurred. But Europe had this fulminant self-destruction between 1914 and 1945, with two massive civil wars and a Great Depression in between. In the midst of the Second War, Churchill, of course, appealed to Roosevelt for the new world to come save the old world this time. And Roosevelt, our greatest president in US history, heard the call and saved the world, not alone, but helped to save the world from fascism. But he did it quite cleverly, which was also FDR's want. He said, "You want us to save you? Yes. You need help? Yes. Okay, we'll lend you what you need." So he was very careful in the Lend-Lease Act and other help that the US gave, that it was all on credit, thank you, because part of the idea was that we should bankrupt Europe by the end of the war so that the US could take up the global mantle. And that was a deliberate policy of geopolitics, not a bad one. The US wanted France and Britain to disgorge its empires, but it also wanted the US to replace those empires in power, and that is indeed what happened. Now, if you look at this next reconstruction by Madison, again, same macro historian, of the consequences of the transition to this next phase of modern global history, you do see something really did change at the end of World War II. And that is a tremendous acceleration of global development. My basic view of this is that what changed is the formal empires ended, and for the first time in history, most of the world could begin to educate their populations, create literacy, and create the beginnings of industrialization in their own countries. Of course, Asia became the greatest success of this, fundamentally transforming the world, but other parts of the world also, for the first time ever, instituted mass education, mass literacy, and the beginnings of economic development. And that curve turns up, and if you measure the growth rates between 1900 and 1950, the world economy grew at 2% aggregate, and between 1950 and 2000, it grew at 4% aggregate. And that's a big difference. When you're growing at 2%, you are doubling every 35 years. When you're growing at 4%, you're doubling at a rate of 17 years. So instead of 2 doublings over 70 years, you actually have a 16 or 4-time increase. You have a 16-time increase at this higher rate of economic growth. So the world was fundamentally transformed. And one very good piece of news is that the number of people living in extreme poverty fell sharply as a result of this. The world really did have economic improvement that is absolutely not an illusion. It's not a statistical artifact. It's not propaganda. It's really the fact that extreme poverty has declined remarkably in this long period of economic growth worldwide, to the point that the World Bank now estimates these numbers in red, that 37% extreme poverty rate as of 1990 has declined to probably about 10% of the world population living in extreme poverty today. That's why we can realistically have goals such as the end of extreme poverty. Not because we're somehow idealistic and think poverty should end, but because we're the heirs to a phenomenally powerful trend of falling poverty rates because of worldwide economic growth. But the US, as Britain, has also created a world, or helped to steer a world, of high inequality. Not the US alone, but certainly it has played its important role in a number of ways. This is a map of inequality, the so-called Gini coefficient. And the areas in red are the areas of high inequality. You see that the darkest red is in southern Africa, where the resource base of diamonds and gold allow for high incomes, but very unequally held because of the colonial history. But you also see the Americas, for example, as a world region of very high inequality, except for the lovely place where we are, because Canada bucks the trend to an important extent. Of course, if we were measuring the impacts on the First Nations and the indigenous populations the right way, there's a lot of extraordinary inequality and inequity that went into the modest inequality today that isn't captured by this. But you do see the border of Canada and the United States as a border of decency to the north and high inequality to the south. That's not exactly news to you, but it is why it's such a pleasure for Sonia and me to be here today, because that's the kind of society we should have. But don't gloat too much, because the real success stories of the world are the Scandinavian countries, because they're the ones with the lowest inequality at very, very high income levels. Now, we saw the map of the places that Britain never invaded. This is a map of the US-built world, where US military bases are everywhere. And the CIA is even more than everywhere. Also on my phone, I think, all the time. But basically, again, capitalism has gone along intrinsically with inequity, especially by the powerful countries of the world. And maybe it is an example of Acton's insight that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that it is the imperial powerhouses that tend to neglect the abuses often, and of course be the ones to impose them. So the United States has ran the show for about half a century. It toppled dozens and dozens of governments. It definitely set back social justice in many parts of the world, because the CIA was terrified of any leader in a Latin American or Middle Eastern or African or Southeast Asian country that used a phrase like social justice. That would mean that they were deeply pernicious to US corporate interests and had to go. And we ended up destroying a lot of stability and overthrowing dozens and dozens of governments around the world, and creating, in part by taking over the role in the Middle East from the UK and France, creating so much of the carnage that we have today. There is nothing wrong with the ability of countries of the Middle East to govern themselves. They've done it for about 2,500 years. The problem is when we go in and stir the pot and muck it up and claim the oil for our own and decide which governments survive and which ones don't, it's not surprising that you end up in nonstop war as we have right now. So just a small recommendation for the US, pack up and get out of there, because there's nothing that can be done by all our drones, all our CIA operations, and all the rest that's going to lead to a bit of good in those countries. This is going to happen. It's going to happen because the world is changing fast. We've entered one more new phase of globalization, and it's the one I want to talk about, our responsibility, because it's our phase of globalization. And it's different from the US-led period after World War II. It's different from the British-led period of 150 years after Watt's steam engine. It is necessarily a truly global world. It's a world in which Adam Smith's insight of the mutual balancing of force around the world is occurring before our eyes. And it's a world that puts new responsibilities and tasks on us to face Kennedy's existential wisdom about our capacities both for good and for destruction. So our phase of globalization has four fundamental dimensions to it. First is that for the first time in at least 200 years, the North Atlantic is no longer going to be the center of the world economy. It is a center. It remains a powerhouse. But we're now in a world in which Asia is going to be at least as important for the world economy as the North Atlantic. And this will change both world economy and geopolitics fundamentally. Second, we're still in a world of rapid demographic change, which I'll describe in a moment. Third, we uniquely are at the end of the environmental tether, because the previous generations did not do their part to head off the threats that we face. And we are the last generation that has the chance to do it. And the fourth area, and the positive one, whether it's the quantum computing that's taking place in the laboratory down the block from here, or the other marvelous inventions and innovations, is that we're living through one of the most dramatic scientific and technological revolutions of history, defined broadly as the information revolution, but meaning the digital revolution, not only in information management, but in nanotechnologies, in manufacturing processes, in genomics, in advanced biotechnology, and countless other areas, all involved in the information revolution. So what do these changes mean? Well, the first change, of course, is we are no longer dominant in the world. If this question, is the American century going to continue? It's over. So the US is militarily very powerful still. We still have enough nuclear weapons, of course, to destroy everything. But the idea of the US as world leader is a little passé at this point. The US is an important country, but it's no longer a dominant country. According to IMF data, China overtook the United States about 5 years ago in this aggregate size of the economy. Of course, not in per person terms, but in the aggregate size of the economy measured at international prices. And my view is that we should think of Northeast Asia as an integrated economic area: China, Korea, Japan. And when we compare that to the European Union or to the United States or to NAFTA, what we see is that Northeast Asia now is a significantly larger economy than our economies. And when we look at where technology is advancing, we now have basically 3 central hubs of technology. We have North America, we have Western Europe, and we have the technology powerhouse of Northeast Asia, which in the aggregate is producing more patents than North America, more patents than Western Europe, but not probably yet of the decisive quality, but it's coming very, very soon. I think it's notable that today it was announced that the Chinese company Tencent has invested significantly in Tesla, and as the story recounted, this company is buying up massive technologies for self-driving vehicles, for electric vehicles, and so forth. In many, many critical areas, China will be the dominant technology force within 15 years, if not sooner. And it's worth taking a look at a recent announcement of the Chinese government called the Made in China 2025 initiative, which is an industrial policy aiming at technological leadership in 10 sectors. And those sectors are information technology, both basic semiconductor technology, robotics and artificial intelligence is number 2, and then 4 transport sectors, electric vehicles, smart shipping, advanced avionics, and high-speed modern rail brings us to 6, and then low-carbon energy technologies is 7. I think smart grids was 8, and then advanced agriculture, 9, and advanced genomics, medicines, and diagnostics, 10. Well, that's the modern economy. And they're aiming, rightly, for technological breakthroughs in all those areas. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is slashing the budget of the National Institutes of Health, stopping the research, trying to lead with that great 19th century technology, coal, which it's unreal. Honestly, he wants to lead us back to the 19th century. And coal is a wonderful thing. We should put it on a pedestal and thank coal every day for creating the modern world. And saying, don't ever burn it again, thank you. It's polluting, it's dangerous, but it was a great stepping stone to clean, green technologies that if we give up everything, China absolutely will lead in the future. What could be happening is Adam Smith's vision coming to life. I can't elaborate on these projections except to say that on a plausible economic scenario, the major regions of the world, by virtue of the poorer countries catching up, are reaching a kind of equality of economies that could lead to a global, cooperative, mutually respectful, balanced world. By the way, China's not going to take over the world. China will be a powerhouse. China's also aging. China also will have a declining population. Thanks God, 60-year-olds don't start too many, well, they may start wars as generals, but they don't fight them. And China will be a country like most of us, battling, or not battling, because I'm all for aging, by the way. I like it better every year. But they will be a country confronting big social and demographic challenges, and a declining population, which will go from something like 1.4 billion now to about 1 billion by the end of this century. And that means that with a per capita income that will probably reach a half to two-thirds of the US-Canada level, that means that China will not become the overwhelming force of the world. It will just be a powerful country in its own right. The same with India, which is now experiencing 7% per year growth. That means a doubling period of every 10 years. And that's likely to continue as well, because India is one of the great beneficiaries and clever users and designers of information technology for rapid catching up. And so that's another possibility. Africa, too, partly because of a rapid continued demographic growth, is raising its share of the world economy. The challenge for Africa is absolutely, thank you, is absolutely to make the final breakthrough out of extreme poverty, which technology makes within reach, especially if we're wise enough, clever enough to give a little bit of help. But here is the point. We are on the edge of wrecking it all. And we're wrecking it all through inadvertence. For a long time, now followed by advertence, greed, and stupidity. Okay? The advertence and greed is ExxonMobil. The stupidity, you can guess who that is. But this is really our problem right now. We have arrived at a world economy that is 7.5 billion people. That is 8 times the population of Watt and Smith's era, 8 times the population when Malthus said, we have a population problem, writing in 1798. And we're still increasing the population of the world by about 80 million per year, mainly in Africa, still right now because of very high fertility rates. But because of this wave of technology after technology, starting with Watt and with the factory revolution and rail and telegraph and the internal combustion engine and modern aviation and the gas turbine and on and on and on, we now have a world productivity that is so extraordinarily high that the average output per person on the planet has reached about $17,000. Of course, some live at less than 1/10 of that, and others live at a multiple of that. That's the inequality. That's the anachronism of poverty. But the sheer scale of what we're doing on the planet is now $125 trillion of output per year, measured at international prices. Well, the Earth's physical systems haven't grown one whit during this period. So we're increasingly impinging on the basic physical systems of the biosphere, the climate systems, the nitrogen, the carbon, the hydrologic cycles, and we're deranging them. And the best description of that is planetary boundaries. The idea that humanity can be so large in its physical impacts that we can absolutely and fundamentally derange basic Earth systems. And a number of ecologists, starting back in 2009, and then writing again in 2015 and publishing another important paper a couple of days ago, have developed this planetary boundaries concept to help us identify where we're hitting hard. And there are 10 points of this bullseye, but to summarize them, one is about our use of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases that warm the planet, that have the property that they absorb infrared radiation, and therefore, when they're in the atmosphere, they act as a kind of trap for heat energy that would otherwise radiate to space. And that's what global warming is doing. And that's one of the great causes of Earth-scale derangement. The same CO2 is dissolving in the oceans, not only warming the oceans, of course, which is responsible for killing 80% of the Great Barrier Reef in the last 3 years, 80% of the most massive coral colonies of the world killed by the warm waters of the last 3 years. But we're also putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we have acidified the oceans, raised the hydrogen proton concentration by 30% already. It's 0.1 of 1 unit of pH. Doesn't sound like much, but remember that's a log scale, so it's 10 to the 0.1 that we have raised the proton concentrations, and we're on a path for a massive increase of acidification that could kill off so much of the remaining mollusk and marine life in short order within decades. Even if there were no climate change from the carbon dioxide, the ocean acidification by itself would be absolutely terrifying. But the second great disaster that's coming is from something that Malthus warned us about 219 years ago, which is that the population problem is you have to produce food for everybody. And we don't have a sustainable food production system. Not only is food production highly vulnerable to all of the environmental changes, it's the #1 driver, actually, of environmental change, which is a little hard for us city types to imagine because the food just seems to get there. And we don't really understand what's happening, but what is happening is that we have deforested so massively, we've depleted so much groundwater, we've destroyed the habitat of so many other species, that food by itself has become the driver of what the ecologists call the 6th great extinction event of the planet, which means the potential loss of millions of species within the coming few decades. And it's already happening. It's happening to countless species we've never met, never named, never identified, but their habitat has been destroyed, and along with it, their place in the biosphere has been destroyed. So we have two overwhelming direct challenges, and I would add a third profound challenge in staying within planetary boundaries. One is a new energy system. Again, to thank all of the coal, oil, and gas production for making the modern world, and saying thank you very much, but it's time to hang up your jersey because we have to go to wind, to solar, to hydro, to nuclear, to other zero carbon energy sources. Because if we continue with the CO2 approach, we're going to wreck the planet. Second, we have to make the transformation to smarter, more information intensive, more precise, more capital intensive agriculture as well. This is perhaps even trickier than the energy transformation. We have to provide food for everybody. That's 7.5 billion people every day, not once in a while. And it has to be reliable, it has to be resilient, and it has to be itself environmentally sustainable. And third, we urgently need to stabilize the world population. And here the choice is the following. Most of the world has already reached a kind of stability of population. Aside from maybe incoming migrants in Canada and still modest levels of growth, most of the world has reached fertility rates that are at or even below the replacement rate of around 2. One part of the world remains with massively high fertility, and that is sub-Saharan Africa, where the fertility rate remains around 5. And it's not really, by the way, the implication of that is easy to understand. every mother, on average, is having 2 to 3 daughters. And that means you can see the tendency of the population to double generation by generation. The medium forecast of the UN on current gradually declining fertility rates is that sub-Saharan Africa, which had a population of 179 million in 1950, and today has a population of 1 billion. So that's an almost 6-time increase. Will reach 4 billion people by 2100. It would not be viable for the African environment, for an escape from poverty. It would be a disaster continuing on that trend. So to stabilize the global population essentially means for Africa to have a rapid voluntary reduction of fertility rates. And the way to accomplish that is actually straightforward. And it's to ensure that all children can stay in school. Period. Doesn't take more than that. Because girls that don't end after 2 or 3 years but become literate, graduate from high school, perhaps continue in training at tertiary level or become community leaders in health or other areas, marry later and choose to have smaller families. And so if we have a whit of wisdom and decency, which is a big if, we would say, how can we help the countries of Africa to ensure universal secondary education as called for in the Sustainable Development Goals? So we're at the end of this story in the sense that if we don't act, we're really on the verge of blowing it badly. Everybody knows that the last 3 years were the warmest 3 years on instrument record, probably the warmest 3 years in thousands of years. But soon, we're going to escape from the climate of the whole Holocene period. That's the period since the last ice age. We're about to start reaching temperatures not seen on the planet for 130,000 years, which was the preceding interglacial period, a period called the Eemian period. And the Eemian period was just 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial temperature, and we've already increased basically 1.1 degrees, so we have less than a degree to go before reaching a mean average temperature that is something we haven't experienced on the planet for 130,000 years. Now here's a depressing fact, which a lot of my colleagues study. They have a nice job. They go around beaches in the world, and they look at the stratigraphy to see where the ocean sea levels were at different times of geologic history. Well, it turns out the last time Earth was 2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial, that's the limit that we have set ourselves to stop global warming. And that's less than a degree warmer than we are right now. The sea level was 6 meters higher than now. 6 meters, which is really depressing if you own an apartment in Manhattan. Fortunately, we own a 3rd-floor apartment, and we're trying to build a pier out the window. But we would be completely underwater. And this is how close we are to disaster at this point. This is what we are courting. And you know it here. How many massive, unprecedented, historic scale forest fires will you have until some of the politicians get the message? And some of the companies. Now, what do we need to do to stay below 2 degrees? We need to turn the carbon dioxide emissions from 10 billion tons, that's 36 billion tons of CO2, 10 billion tons of C, down to 0 by around 2070 to just have a 2/3 probability of avoiding 2 degrees C. If you want a more likely scenario, and if you recognize that 2 degrees C isn't even safe, we have to turn the emissions curve down not by 2070, but by 2050 latest. We have to get out of coal, oil, and gas. Fortunately, we've got a lot of photons hitting the planet and a very low cost of collecting them and turning them into large-scale electricity. We have a lot of thermal radiation creating kinetic energy in the atmosphere in wind that can be harnessed by wind power. We have a lot of kinetic energy in water that can be harnessed in hydroelectric power. Canada has phenomenal capacity. I'm trying to bring some of Quebec's to New York City because that's how we could have a zero-carbon city. And that's truly a win-win proposition. But we have to do this quickly. What we don't need is this. We just don't need any more pipelines to carry 20th century high-carbon energy anywhere. We should go observe it in situ in the beautiful province of Alberta. We don't need it produced. We don't need it shipped. It makes no sense in a climate-safe world. And TransCanada needs to know this. My job will be, if they try to build that pipeline, to talk to any pension fund manager, insurance company. Don't put a penny into that because it's a project doomed to bankruptcy in the future. Because it can't work in a safe world. And we're going to have a safe world, thank you. We're not going to let ourselves destruct the planet. And this energy source is not the phase-out energy source. It's not, well, we need oil and gas for a few more decades, so how about this? Because this is too costly for that kind of energy. The low-cost, marginal production is not Canadian oil sands, which is one of the most expensive kinds of production in the world. So to get to zero, it's actually not complicated. We just need to make sure, all of us together, that this miserable project is never built. That's it. Can we do that together? Please? Fundamentally, this is a question of analytics. It's modestly a question of economics, because my bottom line on the economics is none of this costs very much to do. It's true, I can't make oil executives guarantee them that they can be gazillionaires in the future the easy way that they want to do it right now, which is by wrecking the planet for the rest of us. But decent life for everybody, high living standards, increasing longevity, productivity, no problem. It's not even a heavy financial lift. It's a matter of us deciding to do the right thing. So this is a world leader we need to be listening to every day. And he wrote the best volume on this topic, his encyclical Laudato Si', which, by the way, you can assign in a graduate ecology course, a graduate theology course, or a course in international politics. It works for all of them. It's really a beautiful encyclical. But in the encyclical, he says, interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. That's really what we need right now. We need to understand what we're up against, and we need to work towards solutions. And he made that statement and called on world leaders on September 25th, 2015, to adopt that common vision. And they did just after he spoke in the UN General Assembly by adopting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This is our shared perspective on how to be prosperous, decent, and sustainable. Or as I call it in my new book for the US, smart, fair, and sustainable. Smart means we deploy our great technologies. Fair means there's enough for everybody, so let's make sure everybody's included. And sustainable obviously means that we don't wreck the planet in the process. Canada's doing pretty well, by the way. Not perfectly, but boy, compared to your neighbor, no question. So my team makes an index of SDG performance. Where do you stand? Canada, in our first index, was 13th in the world. Not bad. Notice the countries at the top: Sweden, Denmark, Norway. They're at the top of every list. They're the most fair societies. They have the lowest corruption, the lowest money in politics. And, by the way, in another report that my team puts out, the happiest countries. So one of the things that Gallup International does for us every year is it asks people how they feel about their lives on a ladder with 10 rungs, and we collate that and analyze the information. The happiest country in the world this year in the report we released last week is Norway. Do you see a pattern? Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland. Canada's 7th happiest country in the world. So that's quite nice. And I feel happy here. The United States, on average, in this period was 14th, but actually I can tell you it was 21st for 2016 data alone. We're unhappy and becoming less happy all the time. And I wrote a chapter in this year's report. You can look at it online for free, of course, about how the US is making economic gains, but society is falling apart. Inequality, lack of trust, that's what's killing us. Literally killing us, by the way, because the mortality rates of white, middle-class, working-class Americans has been rising for the last 15 years, unheard of. Opiate epidemics, other drug substance abuse, suicides, because we're so nasty to each other. And because we bought into this, we didn't buy into it, it was imposed on us by a few really, really selfish billionaires, this philosophy called libertarianism, which is worse than a sandbox of kindergarten. In a sandbox in kindergarten, I mean, it's much worse. They say, share your shovel. Whereas libertarianism says, it's my shovel. I don't have to share anything with you. And that passes for a philosophy to the Koch brothers, who really are a nasty piece of work, who inherited they didn't inherit, they have $100 billion between them. The start was inherited from a nasty daddy who raised nasty children. And now we suffer because they bribe a nasty Congress. And so we end up 21st in happiness, and we look up to Canada for guidance. Okay. To achieve the Sustainable Development Goals is not expensive. To decarbonize the world's energy system is less than 1% per year of the global world product. In other words, we have the technology alternatives. With some R&D, the costs would continue to plummet. It's not free. Since the world is $125 trillion per year, it's probably $1 trillion a year to decarbonize. But that's not the real barrier. The real barrier is that some very rich people right now have to say we're going to park our money and understand that we're going out of business. Because our job is to put companies like TransCanada, at least building pipelines, out of business. Because we don't need them anymore. But worse than that is, of course, Exxon and Chevron and Peabody Coal and so on. These are anachronisms who should say, sorry, we understand, we also have children, we're phasing out. That's what we need to hear. we could end all extreme poverty for well under 1% of world output. If the Pearson standard was observed, rather than the current 0.3 of 1% of GDP, it was 1%. My country, by the way, Trump's trying to slash it. We're at 0.17 of 1% of development aid and at 5% of GDP of military spending. Come on, that's a civilization? What are we thinking? And you think we're going to be safe that way, being so nasty? So that is a second thing that could be accomplished. And all of the infrastructure that we need, for example, to ensure safe, clean, modern energy services for everybody, could easily be achieved for between 1% and 2% of global world product per year increment. So we're talking about 3 or 4% of GDP investing per year in order to achieve sustainable development. That's why economics is not really the central question. If this were half the economy needed to be shifted, that'd be an interesting economics question. But the economics is, this is really small stuff for our survival. It's just tough given the systems and the vested interests in place. Now, my experience is every time we actually invest in something, which happens once in a while, we make progress. I begged the George W. Bush White House for years, invest in malaria. I actually told the Undersecretary of State in 2005, no, it was the White House advisor, and I meant it. I said, I'm sorry to be telling you this. It's too good for you people, because I really didn't like them at all. But I wasn't thinking of them and all the pleasure that they would get from the success. I was thinking of people dying of malaria. And eventually, the money finally came to fight malaria, and malaria deaths plummeted. And they're down probably by about 70% now from the peak. So all the excuses that were made, oh, you can't do this, and aid doesn't work, and blah, 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 is just excuses of laziness and greed. It's not real. It's selfishness. And breaking through the system once in a while proves the selfishness. By the way, economists don't understand this, because economists are trained, oh, you can't give money, it'll be stolen, it'll be this and that. And there's actually a study, a new study, where some economists, bless their souls, are trying to understand a big puzzle. And the puzzle is, we gave bed nets, and then we did an audit of the houses, and the bed nets were actually there, not stolen by the health workers. And they're deeply puzzled by this, honestly. And so they finally realize towards the end of the paper that there's this concept called pro-sociality, and maybe the health workers actually did their job. So that's what we're up against also in economics. But the economists are not the biggest problem. The biggest problem are the greedy, very wealthy people, actually. So we need about $10 billion increment to end the AIDS epidemic right now. Amazing, by the way. $10 billion a year would do it over the next decade. And the reason is that with that extra money, you could identify and put every infected person on low-cost antiretroviral treatment. And that breaks the transmission from those people because it reduces the viral load of HIV. So it's a program called 90-90-90. It's not funded, but it's the scientifically appropriate program. And it's short $10 billion a year. For me as a macroeconomist, it's pure pain because, first of all, I'm the only macroeconomist in the world still dealing with billions, because all my friends deal with trillions. And they laugh at me. What are you doing? Aren't you a macroeconomist? Not a microeconomist? But I'm trying to get $10 billion. It's humiliating. The US is spending $2.5 billion a day. So I've been begging them, take a long weekend. And we could get this done. And soldiers would be much happier too. There would be a place without war for 4 days. And we could get AIDS done. So that's really the kind of thing that we're up against. I want to go back to the Catholic teachings for one more moment, because I regard this as the single most important social teaching. And that is, we have to stop thinking about, this is mine, this is ours, this is my shovel, this insanity of libertarianism. But rather, aren't we all in this sandbox together? And the church has a doctrine called the universal destination of goods. And in a beautiful, really wonderful encyclical in 1967, Pope Paul VI wrote the following. He says, "Everyone knows that the fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms. As St. Ambrose put it, quote, 'You are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich.'" This is the most important economic doctrine. And it's also literally true, because we've been appropriating from the poor for so long. We've been taking the oil, the resources, the commodities. We've been overthrowing the governments. We've been enslaving people. We've been conquering people. We've been wrecking their climate, endangering billions of people. So aid is not even aid. It's a modest compensation. But it's basically common sense, which is that we need to find a way to be decent together on the planet. Now, Kennedy had a neat way of getting people to listen. He was very inspiring in his short life. And this is from a speech that he gave in May 1961. It's the speech where he called for going to the moon. And this is where I want to end. He said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." I love this for 1,000 reasons. One, it was my youth, listening or watching every space shot, loving it, until the day that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. It's a kind of miraculous golden period. When Kennedy said this, NASA didn't have a clue as to how to do it. But what Kennedy also says, he recommends this. But he says none will be so difficult or expensive to achieve. It's not all so simple, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to our country. And by saying it that way, by challenging people, isn't this what we should be doing? Isn't this how we can best organize our skills and energies? Of course, the American people rallied, and something absolutely wonderful and long-term was accomplished. And I would argue that sustainable development is our generation's moonshot. This is our chance to deploy our knowledge, our skills, our technology, to end poverty and hunger, to make the planet sustainable, to make the earth fair. It's within our reach, and because of the wondrous technologies we have in our hand, it's absolutely within our grasp in the next few years. Here is one of our problems. Everybody knows the marshmallow test. It was discovered about 30 years ago with a group of 5-year-olds. The 4 or 5-year-old is told by the psychologist, there's a marshmallow or a piece of chocolate in front of you. you can eat it now, but I'm going to go out of the room. I'm going to be back in a few minutes. If you wait, then you can have 2 of them. And then they watch the kids by camera, and they pick it up, they look at it, and some of them eat it, and others hold it. And it turns out that that ability to delay gratification at age 4 or 5 is the single most predictive variable of adult performance in life, which is what this wonderful psychologist, my colleague Walter Mischel, discovered. This is from the New Yorker last month. You can eat the 1 marshmallow right now, or if you wait 15 minutes, I'll give you 2 marshmallows and swear you in as President of the United States. If this had been done, President Pence would have been sworn in. He would have disappeared from our lives. But the fact is, we right now don't have the attention span or the ability of delaying gratification. It depends on us, ladies and gentlemen. We have to say to the politicians, we have to remind them why they're there. We have to say to the companies why they're there. Companies are there to create value. They're not there to raise shareholder wealth by wrecking the world. It's important to ask the head of TransCanada, I don't know the gentleman, but maybe some of you do, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? And if you'd like to know, please call Professor Sachs. He'll explain to you if it's not clear to you what you're doing. Do you have children? Do you have a family? Do you have neighbors? Did you think about that? Is your job to wreck the planet so that you can have another few years of profits? Do you want to trick the investors so that the investment goes bankrupt just a few years later down the road when it's ultimately realized that this is just too desperately bad to use? And we really have to remind our politicians that their job is human well-being. Their job is actually to do what they know how to do, which is to help build coalitions, alliances, public understanding, or what they should know how to do. By the way, their job is not to be experts. That's our job at universities. It's our responsibility. But it's the politician's responsibility actually to listen and to convene and to listen to the expertise and the technical knowledge for the guidance. We don't expect our politicians to know all these things, but we should expect them to follow the truth, follow the science, follow the course of decency. That's their job. Finally, and Canada, I think, is one of the most remarkable and wondrous successes of this. You're almost a proof of concept. We need to learn to live together at a global scale and put aside these petty differences which mean nothing, and stop making accusations about this religion or that religion or this people, this kind of stereotyping and really disgusting view of others in order for us to find common solutions. And I'll end at this point with one final word from President Kennedy. You know, in the last year of his life, when he was in 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Lester Pearson was prime minister here. Pope John the 23rd was the Pope at the Vatican. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was profoundly affected by the near total loss of everything. He had come into office determined to create a safer world, and yet he almost presided over the end of the world. And he realized a couple of things. One is that had he listened to most of his advisors, the world would have ended. And he also intuited that his best colleague in saving the world was Nikita Khrushchev, who probably faced exactly the same problems with his advisors. So Kennedy decided early in 1963 that he needed, to find a way for politics and statecraft in the finest form to do something to pull the world back from the brink. Importantly and interestingly, Pope John XXIII was dying of cancer in early 1963, was also profoundly shaken and moved by the Cuban Missile Crisis, and said that his final energies on Earth would be devoted to peace as well. He produced a marvelous encyclical worth reading and reading and reading called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, which is an encyclical that says statecraft needs to be within a moral framework, so that we can't think of a Machiavellian world. We need to think of a world that is bound by moral principles and where states operate within moral principles. Khrushchev and Kennedy read it, were deeply affected by it. Kennedy decided to launch a campaign for peace with the Soviet Union, which was at the height of the Cold War, something terribly unusual. And he was very worried about it. In the end, he succeeded in negotiating the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. One of the key steps to that was on this occasion at American University, fittingly, where he has beautiful words at the beginning about the role of the university as the unique place to talk about peace, because it is the place that seeks the truth. And so he said, it's fitting that I come to a university to talk about this subject. And he uttered these words, which I find the most beautiful of any president's words in modern times. He said, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.
Will you take a couple of questions?
Of course, yeah.
I think we'll just do probably 2 or 3.
I know, I went on so long. Thank you.
See, I told you. We have time for, I think, only maybe 2 questions. And so, do we have people with the microphones? Yeah, so let's think. Do we see? Here's a question here, okay.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. In your slide where you showed that for less than 5% of the world's domestic product, we could alleviate a number of these issues that are extremely pressing. And then you also talked about talking to the president of TransCanada to get him to see straight. Is there a way that you can clarify the 1% for the global warming in such a way that you could approach the president of TransCanada and say, instead of investing here, if you invest here, you will be economically ahead and you will happen to have contributed towards this objective?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me give you an example of a company that is phasing out of fossil fuels and doing exactly this. It's a very talented company called Statoil, which is the Norwegian oil and gas company. They discovered that the same knowledge that they use to build rugged offshore rigs for offshore drilling is the technology that's needed to build rugged offshore wind facilities. And so they're going to be, I think, world leaders in offshore wind. Offshore wind is wonderful, by the way, because there's a lot of it. And you avoid many problems if we can harness it reliably. But it's a major engineering challenge, both in scale, in deployment, and still in certain aspects of the technology itself. But that's a company that's on exactly that journey. Some companies, I don't know if there's much of a future for them. For the coal companies, I think, again, better to, in the US, they're mostly bankrupt, and that's a good place for them to stay, actually. And, you know, there's so many, it's not even, it's crazy to try to protect those jobs also. Those are not nice jobs. They're terrible jobs of short lives and very difficult. Fortunately, technology is making mining almost completely autonomous without miners, actually, which is a huge benefit anyway. But you know how many coal miners, actually at-the-face coal miners we have in the United States today? Probably about 20,000 total out of 150 million people. So while Donald Trump is yakking on and on this morning in this executive order about all the jobs he's going to save nothing. He's going to determine nothing, by the way. Okay. He's not saving the coal industry. It's the whole day today is just another fiasco showing what a fool he is. Okay. Because there's nothing, these orders don't even matter, by the way. They really don't, because we're just going to fight them every step of the way. And he's not going to get very far in any of this. But it's not about jobs and so forth. You could create 10, 50 times the number of jobs installing solar panels and doing other things. What's the best for TransCanada? I don't know. That's something for TransCanada to analyze given its knowledge and technology. But what is absolutely right, first, this federal government should say, stop. It's just a bad project. We've got to get real. Because Canada is doing everything to decarbonize internally, but don't push the stuff to the rest of the world. We don't want it. The world doesn't need it. It needs to stop. So the government by itself should stop it, but if the government won't stop it because that's what politicians do or don't do, then the company needs to hear very, very clearly. Do something else that is not destructive. Don't give excuses that we need oil and gas for the coming decades, because I'll explain why that is a complete fallacy. Statistically, we do not need Canada's oil sands. I'm sorry, but Canada doesn't need them either. This is a rich, productive, wonderful economy before you booked the extra reserves on the heavy oil. And it'll be a rich, wonderful, prosperous economy when you book them back down to zero. Because Canada's prosperity does not depend on this. Canada's prosperity depends on what's happening in this university. All of the incredible knowledge, sophisticated training, human capital in this society, where many more kids in proportion of their age group finish a tertiary education, for example, than the United States. That's what makes Canada prosperous, not the oil sands. So this is what needs to be explained.
One more question, and I here, so they'll bring you a microphone.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating and very much inspiring talk as well. I just wanted to mention just quickly, I think you're being a little bit too hard on your nation. I think one of the things that we're seeing...
Come visit for a little while.
Well, I have, and I'm going there actually in 2 weeks. But what we see during this perhaps time of crisis is also thousands, literally actually millions of people taking to the street, speaking out as you yourself are. And I think that's also something we have to recognize as a symbol of democracy and a democracy at work. And I think in terms of not patting ourselves on the back too much in Canada, to not repeat the mistakes, perhaps, of our neighbors. But this is sort of leading me to the question, which is about inclusiveness and inequality. And throughout your talk, and you also highlight that very nicely, I think, in your book, where you talk about really inequality is, and as you say, fairness is one of the big questions that needs to be addressed. And, you know, there's a lot of us, all of us have kind of an individual responsibility to that, but I'm wondering, as Professor Jean Andre was saying at the beginning, there's a lot of leaders here today, leaders of departments, leaders of faculties, leaders of cities, and I was wondering, at the very local level, what do you think we can do to make our local economies more inclusive and prevent sort of the winners and losers from the globalization and the way the new economy is sort of unfolding, as you're arguing, you know, there's the benefits that accrue, but they're not distributed equally.
Thank you very much. I think there are 3 things to do fundamentally for creating fair societies. One is to do everything possible to make sure that every child has all of the possibility of developing their talents, their skills, their physical potential as well. And that is a huge lift in a sophisticated society. It means a massive public effort and a massive social effort to make sure that poor kids are not left behind or minority kids are not left behind. And in general, again, the places that do it the best are the social democracies in Northern Europe, but Canada does it very well also. And this, I would say, is task number 1. Task number 2 is to have a fiscal system that is robust enough to redistribute income as needed to ensure that everybody is doing okay in the society, to avoid an underclass. And there again, this is, that kind of fiscal system is well observed all through Northern Europe. And Canada is mostly there, not fully. You know, if you look at Netherlands, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Iceland, they all are taxing at 40 to 50% of GDP, and they're using that for family leave, for early childhood development programs, for support for young children, for decency. In the United States, we're taxing at about 31% of GDP. And so we're about 15 percentage points less than the Scandinavian countries. And Canada is in between, somewhere around 39, 40%. Lower than in the social democracies, much higher than in the United States. And Canada gets a lot of value for what it's paying in taxes, obviously. It gets a happier, more decent, more stable, more peaceful, more welcoming, more inclusive society, and a very prosperous society, and more kids finishing tertiary education as well. So it's very good value. And that's the second pillar, is a fiscal system that is adequate to the task of decency. But look at the crazy people in my country, otherwise known as the Republican leadership. All they want to do is cut taxes again and again. It's a mania. It's an obsession. And it's driven again by these billionaire, nasty, short-sighted people who are pushing these relentless tax cuts And we've been on that racket since 1981, since Ronald Reagan became president. And so that's the second pillar. The third pillar is honesty, decency. And that partly is derivative of these other kinds of fairness, but it's also maintaining some standards of practice. It's having a moral discourse in society. It's saying, you are nasty, sit down, mainly to the Wall Street CEOs, for example, to almost the whole hedge fund industry, which is a socially parasitic sector, in my opinion. Maybe not in every case, but in a lot of them. And I keep finding, you know, it's unbelievable. I'll take the hedge funds for a moment, because I live in their neighborhood, not quite in their neighborhood. We're on the west side, they're on the east side, but they're close enough to know. They cheat, insider trading, financial fraud, front running. And the problem is, when they make their billion then, they're lionized. They're in the White House. They're not called out for their miserable, disgusting behavior. They should be in jail, by the way. People like Stephen A. Cohen. He should have been jailed. Or this Bill Ackman right now, who was front-running an attempted buyout of Allergen by Valiant. This is criminal behavior as far as I can see. And of course, there's John Paulson, who constructed a toxic portfolio so that Goldman could sell it to some unsuspecting German investors so that Paulson could make $1 billion on shorting this toxic portfolio that he created. And then this jerk, rather than getting thrown in jail or getting fined for $1 billion, he gave $400 million of it to Harvard to name the engineering school after him. And you know what? I wrote a letter to the president, an open letter, that why don't you name it after the German bank that he ripped off, not after Mr. Paulson. They weren't amused, by the way. It's the Paulson School of Engineering. But this is the third point, which is we need to maintain basic standards of decency, to know the difference of right and wrong, to know that wealth does not mean someone that you admire. And again, I'll just mention for the 47th time, Sweden and Scandinavia, you know, there are cases where you have leading business people who take a severance package that's too rich, and they get hounded out of their society, actually. They say, how dare you? And they say, oh, this is how it's done in America. Well, it's not done here in Sweden. And leading business people are shamed because they're told, we don't behave that way. And that's not even breaking the law. That's just breaking the social contract or breaking the bounds of decency. So I would put a big stress on decency. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.